Good morning. Please excuse me. I've got a little bit of a, I woke up, I don't know if any of you have problems with allergies, but I'll tell you what, I woke up this morning and it was crazy. So bear with me as I try and regain my voice. You know, I saw a couple of interesting shots, and I don't know if it's a commentary or not from the Lord, but there were two massive lightning strikes in Washington, D.C. One was on the Washington Monument, but the other one, and you can look it up online, the other one was on the White House, and it was like three big strains of lightning hit the White House. I don't know if that's a commentary or on anything or not, but it's on. I saw it online, so you can look it up. But yeah, it could be a wake-up call. Who knows? There are four themes we're going to look at today. Amnon's sexual assault, and it was a sexual assault. Absalom's revenge and departure. Joab's plot to bring Absalom back. And then finally, Absalom's return. So first, let's look at Absalom's sexual assault. Now Amnon is David's firstborn son. And he was also, Amnon was the crown prince. Okay. And what do I mean by crown prince, by the way? Yeah, he's next in line for the throne, first in line for the throne. And Amnon is also infatuated with his sister, his half sister, I should say, Tamar. And he is so infatuated that he becomes obsessed with her. Jack, can you read 2 Samuel 13, 1 and 2?
In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. Amnon became frustrated to the point of illness on account of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her.
All right, so he's kind of goo gaga over his sister, and his sister's a virgin. And so it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. And this frustrates Amnon, because as a virgin, she's available for marriage, but not to him. Why? She's his half sister, and marriage between a brother and a half sister was forbidden. So what is it that made Amnon so persistent? Yeah, I think it was his lust, not his love, his lust. And plus, think about this, as the crown prince, as the king's firstborn son, he probably got everything he wanted. Don't you think? And knowing David probably gave him everything he wanted. So Amnon's cousin, Jonadab, he's a real peach. But Jonadab talks with him, and he helps him develop a plan. 2 Samuel 13, 3 and 4.
Now Amnon had a friend named Jonadab, son of Shimeah, David's brother. Jonadab was a very shrewd man. He asked Amnon, "Why do you, the king's son, look so haggard morning after morning? Won't you tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister."
Now, really? I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I'm going to come back to that in a minute and show you what I'm talking about. But Amnon spills his guts, and he's in love with Tamar. But in reality, he's in lust with her, isn't he? And you'll see why in a minute. And he demonstrates that. So his cousin, actually, Jonadab was his cousin. You know, by the way, everybody's related. Everybody's related. And so he gives him an evil plan. 2 Samuel 13, 5 and 6.
"Go to bed and pretend to be ill," Jonadab said. "When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight so I may watch her and then eat it from her hand.'"
Now think about this. Watch this. Watch what happens here, because David falls right into the plan. Now, first of all, Jonadab's a real scuzzbucket, but that's beside the point. David falls right into the plan. 2 Samuel 13, verses 7 through 10, Jack.
We missed 6 in that, so I'll pick it up at 6.
Okay.
So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, "I would like my sister Tamar to come and make some special bread in my sight, so I may eat from her hand. David sent word to Tamar at the palace, go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him. So Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the bread in his sight, and baked it. Then she took the pan and served him the bread, but he refused to eat. Send everyone out of here, Amnon said. So everyone left him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food here into my bedroom so I may eat from your hand. And Tamar took the bread she had prepared and brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom.
Now, when he explained that he wanted to eat it from her hand, that should have been a little bit of a red flag to David, right? But he didn't get it. And so David calls for her, and the plan begins to take shape. And still Tamar is totally unaware of what's going on. And she, when it happens, she tries to resist, and she appeals to him not to violate her, because she knows what's going to happen. She knew sex with her half-brother would really be disgraceful for her as well as her brother. 2 Samuel 13, 11 through 14, Jack.
But when she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, come to bed with me, my sister. Don't, my brother, she said to him, don't force me. Such a thing would not be done, should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you. But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her.
Yeah, that's essentially what happened. And despite her well-spoken appeal, logical appeal, it didn't make any difference. He raped her. And now Amnon shows his true colors in 2 Samuel 13, 15.
Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, get up and get out.
He hates her. Is there a lesson here, by the way, for young people today? I mean, there is consistent pressure, I think, even more so today, for girls to have sex with boys, and boys push them and push them. I'll tell you what, that's a red flag, isn't it? It's a red flag. If guys aren't willing to wait, then they're the wrong guy. Okay. Question. Someone had their hand up here.
And I was just gonna say, it's men too, it's not just boys.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. But if they can, and really it's pretty standard practice, is it not? But if they continue to push, is that the right person? Is that the person you want to be aligned with? That person you want to marry? So essentially, he shows his colors, he refuses to listen, and then he kicks her out. 2 Samuel 13, 16 through 18, Jack.
No, she said to him, sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me. But he refused to listen to her. He called his personal servant and said, get this woman out of here and bolt the door after her. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. She was wearing a richly ornamented robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore.
So he has no respect for her. He kicks her out, doesn't even refer to her as Tamar. He refers to her as this woman, and just be done with her. Get her out of here. And he could have somewhat redeemed the situation, as Tamar was suggesting, and he could have paid down her dowry, but he didn't do it. Didn't do either. Deuteronomy 22, 28, and 29, Jack.
If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay the girl's father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the girl, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives.
Now, there's a commentary that's coming to my mind here. Do you see anything wrong with that? I mean, it's in God's word, but do you see anything wrong with that? Yeah. And really the guy gets away with it by just paying the father-in-law because he violates a girl. And what that tells me is that was probably more common than we realize. And Jesus is really the one who came and liberated women and treated them as individuals with individual worth and cared for them. And see, essentially, Amnon gets away with this, no big deal. And really, I think monogamy is a design for that's God's purpose, is monogamy. But children model their parents, don't they? And often they take it much further. And God didn't give Adam 2 wives, did he? Nor Eve 2 husbands. Genesis 2:24, Jack, real quickly.
For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh.
The 2 shall become one flesh, not the 4 or 6 or 8. That makes sense? So Tamar's perplexed here. And look at how she responds. Second Samuel 13:19, Jack.
Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornamented robe she was wearing. She put her hand on her head and went away weeping as she went, weeping aloud as she went.
All right, so here we have a travesty, really, isn't it? It's a travesty. And she responds appropriately. Now think about this. You've got a terrible crime that was committed. And it was committed against her. And she wasn't going to hide this crime. It meant, for her, what it meant is that she would never marry. Think about that. She would never marry, never have children, never lead a normal life. Why not? Because she was no longer a virgin. And that made her used and an unwanted outcast. That was the culture of the day. That was the culture, and she could not be married. Well, Absalom sees and hears her. So he responds to her with a pretty, not Absalom, but her brother Epsilon responds to her with a pretty good idea of what happened. And he asks her and then answers his own question. He already knew what had happened, and he tries here to encourage her. 2 Samuel 13:20, Jack.
Her brother Absalom said to her, "Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you?"
Now hold on just a second, Jack. Isn't it interesting that Tamar went to her brother and not her father? Isn't it interesting? Why do you think that was? Huh?
He wasn't a parent.
Well, that's not why. It's not went to her brother. Why would she go to her brother?
Well, David said he wouldn't say anything.
She knew he.
She knew her brother cared, and she go ahead.
Father had preference for the crown prince and he was babying him.
Yeah, she knew that he indulged his sons. He was the appropriate person for her to go to. Why? Because he was the primary judge in Israel. He was the one who made decisions of right and wrong. He was the one that brought justice. But she knew she wouldn't get justice from her father, so she went to her brother.
Yeah.
Her father's in parent. Yeah, no question about that, Carol Ann. Have any of you ever known anyone who indulged their children? Huh? How does that turn out? When you continue, now grace is one thing, but indulging your children, you know, what's the difference between grace and indulgence?
Forgiveness.
Huh?
Forgiveness. And the
What's that?
grace. You forgive them with your grace.
Grace is forgiveness.
So it almost encourages them to continue their activity.
Being able. Indulging, I think, develops a relationship that can't be satisfied.
And really, quite frankly, the more you indulge them, the more they say, well, I'm going to do this because it's no big deal. My parents aren't going to intervene. I'm not going to have to pay the consequences. And essentially, that's a little bit what's going on here. So let's look at Absalom's revenge and his departure. So David finds out about this and he's angry. 2 Samuel 13, 21, 22, Jack.
When King David heard all this, he was furious. Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar.
What's wrong with this picture?
I think it says David was furious, and that's all it says. He didn't do
David was
anything.
furious. That's exactly right. David was furious. Big deal. He was furious, but he didn't do anything. And of course, she knew that. And he just remained silent. He was furious. You're right, Bart. That's exactly right. But he didn't do anything about it. You know, I was interested in this, and really, this is a verse that we talked about. I'll come back to that in a minute. But Solzhenitsyn had something to say about this. Jack, can you read this?
In keeping silent about evil, in burying it so deep within us that no sign of it appears on the surface, we are implanting it, and it will rise up 1,000-fold in the future. When we neither punish nor reproach evildoers, we are not simply protecting their trivial old age, we are thereby ripping the foundations of justice from beneath new generations.
Isn't that true? And Solzhenitsyn has a way of putting things. He just hits the nail on the head on a consistent basis, and he's saying, "Yeah, think what he's saying. We are thereby ripping the foundations of justice from beneath new generations." You've got all kinds of things happening all over the place, and people are looking for justice, are they not? They're looking for justice, and they're not finding justice. See, we know that David's permissiveness, really, in his family, only brought dysfunction, and it brought more dysfunction. Glenn.
Well, fortunately, this reminds me of the restoration discipline process the churches should be practicing. It's why we have so much trouble within the churches today. They're not practicing this, so there's vicariously saying this stuff's okay.
Yeah, no big deal. And you've got church members on top of church members and all kinds of nonsense going on, ethical breaches, and no one's doing anything about it. See, Absalom witnessed everything, and he was outraged by his father's inaction, and he felt the need for justice deeply, didn't he? And he knew it wasn't going to come from his father. So Absalom takes matters in his own hands. Can you appreciate that? Can you appreciate that? Absalom takes matters into his own hands. And he's smart, though. Absalom is smart. He waits 2 full years until everyone is unsuspecting. 2 Samuel 13, 23 through 27.
2 years later, when Absalom's sheep shearers were at Baal Hazor near the border of Ephraim, he invited all the king's sons to come there. Absalom went to the king and said, "Your servant has had shearers come. Will the king and his officials please join me?" "No, my son," the king replied. "All of us should not go. We would only be a burden to you." Although Absalom urged him, he still refused to go, but gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon come with us." The king asked him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom urged him, so he sent with him Amnon and the rest of the king's sons.
Now, sheep shearing in Israel was a pretty festive time, because they've got their coats, we're shearing them. When we're done, we're going to celebrate that. And it would have not have been unusual to invite his brothers to celebrate with him, which is exactly what he did. So here they finally are at the camp, and all of the sons are there celebrating together, drinking wine, having fun, feeling good. And it seemed innocent enough, but Absalom had a sinister plot in mind, didn't he? He had given his servants an order, and he said, "Wait till this guy gets drunk or has a little wine in him, and he's feeling good and he's feeling comfortable, and then strike him and kill him." That's what he told them. So the servants did that. They did exactly what Absalom directed them to do. And I think there are some important points here. First, we have to consider God promised David. This is a result of David's dysfunction, David's disobedience, because God promised David something that he was now beginning to bring to fruition. What was it that he promised him? The sword will never depart from your house. 2 Samuel 12:10, Jack.
Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own.
So God promised us. God said this was coming. Get ready for it. I don't think you're ever ready for that, Alvin.
He said, you did this in secret. He said, but my response to this is going to be before all Israel, before the sun.
And you know, I found an interesting quote online here too. It said, "Is David?" Jack, can you read that?
As David had committed adultery, made Uriah drunk, and then murdered him, so Amnon committed incest, is made drunk, and is then murdered. God promised David that this would happen, that his house would be in turmoil because of his sin.
And that's exactly what happened. So David gets a report, and initially it's grossly exaggerated. 2 Samuel 13:30 through 33, Jack.
While they were on their way, the report came to David. Absalom has struck down all the king's sons. Not one of them is left. The king stood up, tore his clothes, and lay down on the ground, and all his servants stood by with their clothes torn. But Jonadab, son of Shimeah, David's brother, said, my lord should not think that they killed all the princes. Only Amnon is dead. This has been Absalom's expressed intention ever since the day Amnon raped his sister Tamar. My lord the king should not be concerned about the report that all the king's sons are dead. Only Amnon is dead.
So Jonadab, hero that he is, who created this mess or helped create this mess, he sets things straight. But one of the things he said was, and he made David understand why Absalom killed Amnon. Did you hear that in there? And he said it was because of what he did to Tamar. And David's got to be somewhat self-incriminated here, isn't he? I mean, he's got to take a look at this and say, I should have done something. What should he have done? What should he have done? I mean, the penalty for this, without paying the dowry, without doing anything, particularly for incest, is really death. That was the penalty for that. And yet he didn't do anything. He looked the other way. Now I mentioned earlier, you can't make this stuff up. Yet there are plenty of people who believe just that it was made up. The Bible's pretty much fiction, nice stories, but pretty much fiction. They might have a moral, but they're pretty much fiction. They're for our entertainment, but maybe there's a moral in there somewhere, but they're not at all real. Now, have you ever heard that? Have you read that, seen that anywhere? Here are some real comments that people actually absorb and believe, and a lot of people agree with them. Jack, can you read some of these things?
Yes, as I pre-read these, I found them offensive, but I will go ahead and read.
Yeah, they are offensive. They are offensive.
The Bible was cobbled together from different sources. Some of them were mythical, like Genesis and others. Deuteronomy is an outright fabrication.
Really? All right, go ahead.
It's very obvious that the stories in the Bible are fictitious. You don't need a team of archaeologists to find that any story that contradicts known physical laws is inaccurate.
All right, now let me just stop right here. Well, read the last one, Jack, and then I'll come back to some.
They are legends written down long after any factual events took place. They're no different than the stories of Hercules or any other god myths. They were meant to inspire what their society labeled as moral behavior.
What do you think about that?
Walk out of the church.
That's when you stand up and walk out of church. Yeah, Bart.
It says that there has to be fiction if it contradicts known physical laws. It's simply a denial that there is God.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And denial that there is a supernatural. Let's go back. Look at the second one here. It's very obvious to whom? It's very obvious, really? That the stories in the Bible are fictitious. What makes them so obvious? And as a matter of fact, then this person goes on to say, you don't need a team of archaeologists to find out that any story that contradicts known physical laws is inaccurate. Baloney. And by the way, there is plenty of archaeology that supports the Bible. As a matter of fact, science has been defeated by the Bible multiple times over many years.
There is no archaeological discovery that has refuted the Bible.
That's not what he says.
She's not speaking the truth.
And besides, I'm sorry. Let me ask you a question. Now think about that. Who would create fictional legends to inspire us? That's what one person said. To inspire us about rape, about incest, about adultery, about murder, about revenge. Really? And that's supposed to inspire us, John?
That's one of the reasons why I believe the Bible is true, is because if a man had just made these up, you would not have put those kinds of stories in.
Man, I'll tell you what, they put all the dirty laundry out there, right in front of people. In my neighborhood where I grew up, okay, there was a code, and the code was keep your dirty laundry inside the house. Don't be speaking outside the house about what's going on. Don Corleone said that too. But effectively, you got to keep it inside of it. Well, we're blasting it all over the place. And John, you're right. That makes it even more authentic. Yeah, Mario.
It calls into question then that this person or persons cannot believe in Jesus. He quoted from Deuteronomy, what the the book, number one. Number two, Genesis is the foundation without which there is no,
Well, what's interesting is that a lot of the arguments are really straw men, because if you pursue it academically and intellectually and break down and look at the evidence and look at what the Bible is saying. And I know several, Patrick Glynn wrote a book called God, the Evidence. He was a professor at George Washington University, came out in the 90s. He was a bestseller because he, like a lot of other people, decided his wife became a Christian. He decided he was going to really investigate, and not just investigate one discipline. He was going to investigate multiple disciplines. And he found incredible, overwhelming evidence that supports the supernatural, supports God. At the time he wrote the book, he hadn't come to become a Christian, but he was moving in that direction, that's for sure. Anybody ever read that book? God, the Evidence? It's God, the Evidence. If you haven't, it's a great book. It's a thin little book, but he goes through multiple disciplines with evidence that, in fact, the Bible is true and what they say about God is accurate. Marvin.
Why would I want to be in a profession throughout my whole life if I didn't believe in it? And I mean, that makes no sense.
Well, you believe versions of it. Why did the priests way back in ancient Israel, why did the priests not believe in the resurrection? I mean, really? So you die and you're done, right? Yeah.
People like the comfort that church brings them. They don't like the discomfort of confronting your sin. And therefore, these things have got to be myths and contradictions.
And therefore, they look for churches who don't preach about sin. And I'll tell you, we've got plenty of churches around that don't preach about sin, that don't preach about repentance, that don't preach about forgiveness, don't preach about grace. They preach about kind of country club issues. But I digress. David's grieved here. And he's grieved because he lost his son and the crown prince, but also he knows that he's guilty. He knows that he committed incest, that he raped his sister. And his lack of discipline brought all this on. And had he corrected him in a biblical way, he'd still be alive. Jack, can you read Exodus 22, 16, and 17?
If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins.
All right, so David doesn't do any of this, and there's no justice for his daughter. Is this relevant to us today? How so?
Well, there's sin of commission, there's sin of omission. And he was guilty of sin of omission and will pay the price for what he's done, or lack of what he's done. And
Well, there are both sins of commission and omission today, and that's precisely what I'm talking about. Let me show you here. And this is brought to you by George Soros and Company. Look what you got here. You got cities bracing for a deadly summer. You've got defund the police, which backfires. You've got a 2,000% rise in the murder rate. You've got street violence on the rise. All of these things are happening today in our cities. And decent, hardworking citizens live in fear. The criminals used to live in fear. Okay? Criminals used to be afraid that they'd get caught, that they'd go to jail, that they spend time in the big house. And now it's the citizens who are afraid. And as a matter of fact, citizens are afraid to defend themselves because they know if they defend themselves and shoot somebody and kill them, they're probably going to go to jail. You think I'm kidding? Take a look here. Look at crime. I mean, first of all, Portland and Seattle are like war zones. But take a look at the increases. This is an increase from this time last year. Atlanta, homicides are up 58%, 40% shootings. New York City, they're up 13%, and shootings are up 64%. Portland, 533% and 126. Chicago, only 5%. Yeah, big deal. They're already the highest ever, and many more than all of those. You know, but I put that in there to, no, I didn't. And you've got somebody like Lori Lightfoot who gets up there and brags about that. Oh, well, murders are down. No, they're not. They're at an all-time high. Los Angeles, homicides up 22%, shootings up 51%. Philadelphia, 37%, 27%. And you've got similar increases in all of those things, in rape, assault, shoplifting, carjacking, fentanyl, all of those things. What's going on here? There's a great line in there's a great line in Moonstruck. How many have seen the movie Moonstruck? The world is going the world is going down the toilet, but it really is, isn't it? So what's the cause of all this?
lack of discipline, accountability.
You got a lack of discipline, lack of accountability, a lack of justice.
God.
What's that?
Sin breeds sin.
Well, sin breeds sin, but you got a bunch of district attorneys and attorneys general who are appointed by nefarious sources. And quite frankly, the idea was the trade-off, we'll give you plenty of money, you win the election, and then you make the calls our way.
It comes out of our universities where the last 3 decades of saying there was no such thing as truth. There's your truth and my truth. But when that comes to truth.
Truth is relative.
Yeah.
There's no objective truth.
Mean whatever I think is right, I'll do, and that's what these attorney generals would do.
Homes or no count fathers.
Well, so that's what Todd is trying to do. Build a Christian school in the middle of the West End. And he believes that he'll have an effect. He can change the West End if his school is big enough and supported well enough. He believes that when you provide, and I believe this too, when you provide high expectations, you remember President Bush? Remember what President Bush said? The benign racism of low expectations. And that exists in our schools. If you provide high expectations, if you provide structure, if you provide safety, they have a safe place to learn, and you provide love, you can accomplish great things with kids educationally. Do you know that all of these kids who came to him were well below grade level? In 46 days, and that includes weekends, in 46 days, they were up to reading at grade level.
This is off this subject, but I have a question. Are they going to do charter schools here? And would they be able to make his school a charter school?
Well, they could, but my advice to him is not to do that because you get co-opted by Jefferson County. They wanted, when I was on the board of the West End School, and Jay, you remember this, that they wanted the West End School to become a charter school. And I said, no way. Because effectively, and it wasn't just me, our whole board, I told Robert Blair, who founded the school, I said, Robert, if they make this a charter school, that's going to become the poster child. I'm not in. Yeah,
Charter colleges too, Hillsdale and Grove City colleges do not take one dime from the.
Federal funds. Yeah, Glenn.
Same thing with Christian Academy, I was on board. Refuse to take any money from the government, because as soon as you start taking that dollar from the government, they start dictating what you teach.
Yes.
And that's what you can't do.
Southern Seminary, same way. Southern
Yeah.
Seminary, same way, no federal money.
Well, let's take a look at this, because effectively, really, and Andy Stanley has said this, that the Old Testament's irrelevant, right? I mean, we're dealing with this stuff. Why? Because these are human problems and human issues, and we continue to deal with them. And when there is no justice, when we look the other way, that's what happens. So it's almost a microcosm of society, isn't it? So, well, Absalom knows he's in trouble, okay? So he flees to the king of Geshur. 2 Samuel 13, 37 through 39.
Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. But King David mourned for his son every day. After Absalom fled and went to Geshur, he stayed there 3 years, and the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death.
All right, now wait a minute. I stopped right here and I said, why in the heck would he go to Talmai, who's the king of Geshur? I mean, he'd have to cross the Jordan River and go into the mountains and travel to Gershon. And it's nearly 100 miles from Jerusalem over very rough terrain. And so then I said, well, who's this king? And what made Absalom believe that he'd be safe?
It's his grandfather.
Oh, see, you spoiled the fun. It's his grandfather. And based on the history of David doing nothing, that he thought also that he'd never be chased. Don't you think? Let's look at 2 Samuel 3:3.
His second, Eliab, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur.
And that's what I found. In other words, I found that the king, okay, was father to one of David's wives, okay, and in fact, Absalom was his grandson. So Terry, Mike, can you give her a gold star, please? But let me ask you this: why didn't Absalom just go to a city, maybe a city of refuge, which was most close? By the way, what were cities of refuge? What were cities of refuge? And there were several cities of refuge. Yeah, Terry.
We could flee from the avenger and be safe until something can be decided.
So an avenger of blood is somebody in your family who succeeds you if you've been killed, and they avenge your death. Okay, but there were cities of refuge you can go to where you were, excuse me, where you'd be safe. Now, why didn't he just do one? I mean, there are a lot of cities of refuge closer to Jerusalem than with his grandfather. Why did he do that? Why did he go? Yeah, Alvin.
Because there was a process after you went there and you told the elders of the city what your version of the story was. Then the elders of the where the murder took place would come, and if they were convinced that this was not true, then they would hand him over to the elders of the city from where the murder occurred.
So cities of refuge were there to protect the innocent, not the guilty. And he clearly was guilty. So he was with his grandfather for 3 years, actually. And all this time, David is longing for him. So, you don't hear anything about Tamar. He's longing for his son. And essentially, in the same way, David is now, same way indulged Amnon, is now indulging Absalom. And this is going to be, it's going to prove to be a detriment in the future. So let's move on to chapter 14 and Joab's plot to bring Absalom back. So Joab knows that David is bothered by his estrangement. And he creates a plan. And he goes to Tekoa and gets a woman. And he tells her what to do. 2 Samuel 14, 1-3, Jack.
Joab, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa and had a wise woman brought from there. He said to her, pretend you are in mourning, dress in mourning clothes, and don't use any cosmetic lotions. Act like a woman who has spent many days grieving for the dead. Then go to the king and speak these words to him. And Joab put the words in her mouth.
So the woman goes to King David and she tells him the story just like Joab coached her to do. Take a look at this, 2 Samuel 14, 4-11, Jack.
When the woman from Tekoa went to the king, she fell with her face to the ground to pay him honor, and she said, help me, O king. The king asked her, what is troubling you? She said, I am indeed a widow. My husband is dead. I, your servant, had 2 sons. They got into a fight with each other in the field, and no one was there to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant. They say, hand over the one who struck his brother down, so we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. Then we will get rid of the heir as well. They would put out the only burning coal I have left, leaving my husband neither name nor descendant on the face of the earth.
Now, hold on a second, Jack. Because appealing to the king, as I said earlier, that was correct. That was right in ancient times. You were going to the king for justice. And particularly if they believed that certain judges weren't fair. So this woman is appealing to the king. And the avenger of blood is responsible for avenging the death of a family member. So go ahead, Jack.
The king said to the woman, go home, and I will issue an order in your behalf. But the woman from Tekoa said to him, my lord the king, let the blame rest on me and on my father's family, and let the king and his throne be without guilt.
All right, so she's not done here. She's got more. There's more to the story.
The king replied, if anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he will not bother you again. She said, then let the king invoke the Lord, his God, to prevent the avenger of blood from adding to the destruction, so that my son will not be destroyed. As surely as the Lord lives, he said, not one hair of your son's head will fall to the ground.
Okay, so this woman appeals to David. David gives her a reprieve. He's gonna intervene. He's gonna protect her sons, all this stuff. Now, he provides justice here, but first and foremost, he doesn't provide justice for his daughter, does he? Okay, outside family, and he would have been the person that she would have gone to appeal. So this stuff is getting more and more complicated. And then it becomes personal. 2 Samuel 14, 12-17, Jack.
Then the woman said, let your servant speak a word to my lord the king. Speak, he replied. The woman said, why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son. Like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be recovered, so we must die. But God does not take away life. Instead, he devises ways so that a banished person may not remain estranged to him. How far was I going?
17.
Okay. And now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I will speak to the king. Perhaps he will do what his servant asks. Perhaps the king will agree to deliver his servant from the hand of the man who is trying to cut off both me and my son from the inheritance God gave us. And now your servant says, may the word of the Lord, the king, may the word of my lord, the king, bring me rest. For my lord, the king, is like an angel of God in discerning good and evil. May the Lord your God be with you.
All right. So what she's basically telling David is find a way to reconcile with your son before it's too late. And, you know, Absalom's sitting back there not being reconciled, and he's getting more and more and more and more bitter. And David has a responsibility to initiate some kind of reconciliation, even though if he approached, he might be rejected. And the only problem here is that God doesn't compromise justice to reconcile, does it? God doesn't compromise justice to reconcile. And so still up to this point, David wouldn't budge. And of course, God really satisfies justice, and he does it through Jesus, does he not? I mean, Jesus is the one that God satisfies justice. And can you read that, Jack?
There are only two ways that God's justice can be satisfied with respect to your sin. Either you satisfy it or Christ satisfies it. You can satisfy it by being banished from God's presence forever, or you can accept the satisfaction that Jesus Christ has made.
See, isn't that the point of this passage here? It really points to Jesus. The whole idea here is about Jesus. He went to the cross. See, David's got a dilemma as a human being. He can't initiate reconciliation without executing justice. And if he executes justice in the right way, his son's going to be killed. But Jesus instead went to the cross for us, and he received what we should have received. And God executed justice through Jesus on Jesus for us. So God is both the judge and the justifier. Doesn't it say somewhere like that in scripture or something like that? Yeah. But God is a judge and justifier. So David smells a rat here. Okay. So he asked Joab, who put her up to this? Or he asked her if Joab put her up to this. 2 Samuel 14, 18 through 20.
Then the king said to the woman, do not keep from me the answer to what I am going to ask you. Let my lord the king speak, the woman said. The king asked, isn't the hand of Joab with you in all this?
Of course, he says yes.
The woman answered, as surely as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or to the left from anything my lord the king says. Yes, it was your servant Joab who instructed me to do this and who put all these words into the mouth of your servant. Your servant Joab did this to change the present situation. My lord has wisdom like that of an angel of God. He knows everything that happens in the land.
Now she's buttering him up here a little bit too, throwing bouquets at him because he didn't want to get killed for participating in this plot. But Joab knew exactly what would move David. So finally, let's take a look at the return of Absalom. And he returns to Jerusalem, but not without some conditions. In verse 25 through 27, we learned that Absalom is good looking, and so is his daughter Tamar. And he has thick black hair. Now that's going to come into play a little later on, but that's a nice bit of information, isn't it? Good looking, thick black hair. And more about that hair later. But Absalom has been there now for 2 years, but he hasn't seen his father. 2 Samuel 14, 28 through 32, Jack.
Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face.
So he had been reconciled, but not completely.
Then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king, but Joab refused to come to him. So he sent a second time, but he refused to come.
So Joab's not talking to him either. He knows what's going on. He knows what David wants. He's not gonna entertain this guy. So what does he do, Jack?
Then he said to his servants, "Look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab did go to Absalom's house, and he said to him, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" Absalom said to Joab, "Look, I sent word to you and said, 'Come here so I can send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me if I were still there. Now then, I want to see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death."
So the fire was a catalyst. And I read something interesting by who but Spurgeon. And Jack, can you read this? But I put Spurgeon's picture up in the top left-hand corner as he's smoking a cigar. That was for John's benefit. But go ahead.
Sometimes God gets our attention by setting our barley field on fire. He, knowing that we will not come by any other means, sends a serious trial. He sets our barley field on fire, which he has a right to do, seeing our barley fields are far more his than they are ours.
Isn't that true? And sometimes God sets our barley. Who can testify that happens? Only a few of you. I mean, God wants to get our attention. When he gets our attention, sometimes he creates turmoil in our lives. And I don't know what he's been getting my attention for, but we've had lots of turmoil that we're dealing with. Sometimes there are attacks by the enemy, but sometimes God's trying to get your attention about something. And it's not all bad. God, what's interesting about it is that God's intention for you is not to necessarily make you happy. We talk about Romans 8:28. For we know that all things work together for good. Those are for those good, to those who are called. Yeah, okay. Say it again. For we know that all things work together for good for those. Yeah, I just threw a blank. But Romans 8:29, I apologize for that. But Romans 8:29 is, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ. So his purpose for us is not to make us happy. His purpose for us is to conform us to his image, and he'll do what he needs to do to get it done. Tom.
Comes before strength.
Well, and there are lots of different ways of suffering. Oftentimes when you're a swimmer, they have a thing called taper. Anybody know what taper is? Well, for example, one of the things they do is they begin to taper you for a big meet. But when my son was swimming, they swam somewhere in the vicinity of 12 to 15,000 meters a day. Okay. But when they swam and got ready for a big meet, they'd cut it back to about 4,000. And you can only do a taper a couple times a year, but they cut it back to 4,000. What that does is it makes you stronger. Okay. You break your body down and then build it up. Well, that's a principle that God does too. Sometimes he has to break us down to build us up. So when you're in the middle of it, you need to think about, what is it that God's trying to teach me, or what does God want from me? And so if you take a look at Absalom too, what does it show us about Absalom here? Burns down the field. He knew that Joab wasn't going to do anything to him because his father wasn't going to do anything to him. What's that tell you about Joab? I think it tells us he's a bit of a spoiled brat, right? A privileged spoiled brat. He was banished because he murdered his brother, but he believed he was justified. Still, he's going to get what he wants when he wants it. And he wanted it now. Terry, you're going to say something?
I just misunderstood something you said about it.
But his 2 years, his bitterness grew. And he's saying here, I need to talk to my father. And he adds dramatically, if there's any sin in me, which there was plenty, let him kill me. Well, he knew David's not going to kill him. But Absalom felt perfectly justified in the killing of Amnon. And he probably wants to go after David for not doing anything. And eventually he does go after David. So finally, if you take a look at this, Absalom's plan works and Joab goes to David to intercede. And David finally receives his son, and Absalom bows to the ground as a sign of submission. But is it sincere? I think not. I don't think so. And particularly after burning Joab's field and growing in bitterness towards David, I doubt very much that was sincere. So David finally forgives Absalom. As a sign of forgiveness, he kisses him. 2 Samuel 14:33.
So Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed Absalom.
Now David does this without any repentance on Absalom's part. But as Israel's chief judge, David has a larger responsibility, does he not? And he was ignoring that responsibility. His responsibility was for justice. And he was responsible for Israel's well-being and his safety. So let me ask you, do you think under these circumstances that Absalom posed a threat? Do you think he posed a threat? Absolutely, he posed a threat. And he would become a threat. As a matter of fact, he would try and overthrow his father. He hated his father. He hated what he stood for, and he was going to try and turn everything upside down, and he did. David's forgiveness was hardly adequate, and there are several reasons. I think first and foremost, as a father and a leader, he lacked credibility because there was no justice for Tamar. Now, Amnon should have been disciplined according to God and God's law, and yet he wasn't. See, David used a double standard and looked the other way. How many of you have ever been in working situations where there's a double standard? That's not fun, is it? It's annoying. Second, if Absalom was to come back, David should have dealt with him right away. Not wait 2 and 3 years, not wait 3 years and then 2 more years. There should have been disciplinary measures. And third, David himself was compromised. Why do I say that? Well, he was compromised because he had already compromised himself with Bathsheba in adultery and with Uriah with murder. Do you think any of that ever got out? Do you think his son may have known or heard anything about that? You see, the inadequacy of David's forgiveness and his lack of credibility eventually leads to rebellion. Jerry.
I noticed also here too that Absalom says, if I'm guilty of anything, let him put me to death. He knows he's guilty, so it's almost like he resents also not receiving the justice he should have done.
Well, he knows that his father's never going to put him to death. And he knows his father is weak towards discipline and justice. So now we're going to talk next week about Absalom's rebellion.